after learning about slots, which allow us to distribute content, I now want to add some other dynamic thing we can add to our components. Specifically, how we can use something called dynamic components. Now, what are dynamic components? Well, imagine you not only have your quote here, which we registered as a component, but you do have two other components. Let's say you also have the app offer component and the app new component. Now I will quickly create these files here. So I have my offer.view file and then I have my new.view file with a lowercase v here. And then I'll quickly copy my quote in there, remove the styling, don't need that. And all I want to display here inside this div is a h3 tag where I say the offer, so it's just some dummy content. And in my new quote, or excuse me, in my new component, I also only want to display new quote. So we're not able to do anything here because I want to show something else, but we do have three distinct components now. With that, I can quickly import them here. So the offer and of course also the new file and then assign it here. So three components in place. We know that setup. Now I want to dynamically decide which one to display here. I don't want to display all three. I'm not going to add app offer and so on. I'm not going to add all these selectors. Instead, I only have one place here where I want to display any of the three components depending on which button was pressed. So I will add three buttons here above this component part. The first one will select the quote component, the second one will select the offer component, and the last one will select the new component. To make this happen, I'll add a new field in my data property, and there I want to store the new property selected component, let's say. And by default, this shall be my app quote component or app quote written like this. So the name of this selector here basically. So this will be my default component. And here when I click this, I will set add click. Well, in this case here, I want to say selected component equals app quote. So the default. But in the other two cases, I of course want to select app offer. And here I want to select app new. Now that's not doing anything though. I set this up so I can change this property, but it doesn't have any effect. We can see it if I print it out here. Let's simply output selected component to see if it generally works. So if we save this and I click offer and new, we see it change. But now I want to also change the actually loaded component down there. To do this, I'll introduce a so-called dynamic component. How do we do that? For this, I will comment out the old selector here so that we still can see it. But now I use the component here. This selector is a reserved word, just like slot. Component is also recognized by Vue.js, and component allows us to dynamically add components. I can bind component to a property which holds the component which should get loaded. So here to bind it, I have to use the is attribute and use a colon to bind it to a data property, so to a dynamic property. And then I want to bind this to selected component like that. What this does is, and is a keyword of course, what this does is that this component now gets bound to the selected component property down there, which is app quote by default, and it will then have a look at the value of selected component, which has to be a string, and that string is then interpreted as the selector of the component, which now should get loaded dynamically. So app quote by default. Therefore, if I save this and I reload this, well, we still see it work, but we don't pass any content, of course, because I don't have a content in between. If I now say default content here in between, Well, we see that gets occupied down there in our default slot. Now watch what happens if I load the offer. Now we see the offer component, and with new, we see the new quote component, and with quote, we go back to the default content. This is how we can use dynamic components to dynamically replace a part in our template with different components triggered by, for example, button clicks and stored in a property which is bound with the is keyword here.